Hello, everybody. Welcome to another virtual Atlanta.net users group meeting. We're going to get started here in just a moment. I wanted to let everybody know that we are starting to look at how we can get back together again, maybe do a hybrid type of meeting where we'll have in-person options and online options, still using Teams. And I'll be sending out an email for everybody with more details on that. We are looking at a change of location. We used to meet in Alpharetta at the MTC, but with the new Microsoft facility, much larger Microsoft facility down in Atlantic Yards, which is right across the road from Atlantic Station, that facility is also absorbing the MTC. So pretty much everything that's going on is going to be happening there, at least until the really large Microsoft facility gets built out, which is about 90 acres worth of campus on the other side of town. But that's probably 5-6 years from now. So in the meantime, we're going to be camping out at the new Microsoft garage at Atlantic Yards. But I'll send out some more details on that, and also timing. Technically, the facility isn't even open yet, so we'll be one of the first things taking place down there, besides obviously the engineering teams and stuff that live there. So without any further ado, Robert, I'm going to turn it over to you and take us through who you are.
Okay.
And this fast web thing of which you speak.
Yes. All right. Well, let me share my screen here. Let me know if you can see everything okay.
Looks good.
All right. So we're going to talk about making the web faster. A little bit about myself. So I'm a Microsoft MVP, Progress Ninja for Fiddler. I'm a Pluralsight author. I do have a lot of things in this talk. You can see some more details on some of the Pluralsight courses I have. I have the Twitter, email, and blog information. And then I do have the code. So I've basically got two sets of code, a before and an after. So I basically set up the exact same page. I'm not a designer, so I used Bootstrap, but I created just a basic travel page. And I'm just comparing. One has none of the performance techniques, and the other one has quite a few of them, not all of them. And I'm going to give you access to the code and the slides at the end, so I'll have a link for that. So let's get started. So I used to work on compilers actually when I was in college and such. So when I thought about performance, and I work on an e-commerce site now, I was thinking about ASP.NET and C#. I was thinking server-side code, like I needed to spend a lot of time there to improve my performance. And about when I was doing some serious looking, Steve Soder's had the seminal book in the area was his 14 things you need to do for web performance. And the biggest thing I took from that is 80 to 90% of the time people wait is spent waiting for page resources, not backend code. So obviously this is average for most sites. I'll show you how you can see if your site is true for this or not. But it really isn't about, for me, optimizing server-side code and C# code and all that sort of stuff. It's really focusing on images, fonts, JavaScript, CSS, and everything else. There's three main rules to focus on. We want to make fewer HTTP requests. And I put that in italics because I am going to talk later about HTTP 2 and the impact that has on this. But ideally, the less requests you can make, the better. Don't request things you obviously don't need. But we used to use a lot of techniques in the HTTP 1.1 days that were specifically to cut down the number of requests, and that's not as important. And again, I'll get back to that with HTTP 2 later in the talk. You want to send as little as possible, and you want to send it as infrequently as possible. So the techniques we'll look at will map back to these. And the good news is this is not ASP.NET specific. Anybody doing web work, these same things apply. So, language, framework agnostic, which is good. I use Fiddler. I'm going to use it throughout the talks. I just wanted to mention what it was. So Fiddler is a tracing tool built specifically for HTTP and HTTPS. It was created by Eric Lawrence when he was at Microsoft. It was a side project of his. It was acquired by Telerik in 2012. So I gave you a link there where you can go get Fiddler. If you weren't aware, so I've been using Fiddler Classic for a really long time. They've now come out with Fiddler Everywhere, which is cross-platform. So if you're on Linux or Mac, or you want to take advantage of some of the user interface improvements and some of the collaboration and sharing things, you can look into Fiddler Everywhere is available as well. But I'm going to start with this because often I'll run into people at a conference, they'll say, hey, I'm having performance issues. The first thing I'll usually do is pop open Fiddler and just get an idea of how the site looks. So I'm going to open up Fiddler Classic here because a couple of the features I'm going to show today are only in Classic, so I'm going to just start there. And we will take a look at the before version. So I'm going to open it up. I'm going to hit Control F5 just because I want to make sure that I don't have anything cached. But like I said, this is a Bootstrap site. Little carousel, some pictures down below here, and some basic content. So that's the before version. So let's take a look at what that looks like in Fiddler. So I'm going to do a lot of things throughout the talk, but usually I like to start here, and you can go into statistics, and you can see that I made 12 separate requests, but it was about 2.9 meg. Typical web pages today are anywhere from 75 to 100 requests, and it's pretty typical to be around 3 meg. So the size is average. I want to do better than that, but the number of requests, I don't have that many. But like I said, that'll give us a basic context, and if I go through here, I can get a quick breakdown of where the content's coming from. So I can see that JPEG is most of the page weight, and I can see sizes here and caching and things that we'll talk about shortly. I'm going to clear that out now and show you the after version. And again, I'm going to hit Control F5 just to make sure it's refreshed. You'll see that visually it looks the same, but if I go into Fiddler, again, I'll go to statistics, and you'll see it was 12 requests, but it's down to 130K. So if you think back to what we had before, I had images that were nearly 3 times larger than the entire page is now. So we're going to focus on the techniques we are using here and why that made such a huge difference. But that brought it from about 3 meg down to 128K. And again, if I look at it, my goal is to make it visually the same. I don't want you to notice that I've done things to it to make it look or perform better. Okay. It's Fiddler. First thing with performance, think about your metrics. So there are a ton of metrics around web performance. I put the first one in italics, that first byte. So when your browser contacts the server does the server-side work, sends the first byte back to the client. That's what that metric is. I don't usually use it today for our site, but I do keep an eye on it if people are having performance problems. If that was high, that would indicate that you have server-side issues. So typically most sites I look at, that's anywhere from 200 to 400 milliseconds. I've seen sites where that's been 2.5 seconds. And so the focus there is really you do have something server-side you need to fix rather than some of the other things. I've been using speed index for a while. I'm going to talk about webpagetest.org. It's a metric that they developed to tell you about how many, turns out to be milliseconds, it takes before most of the content in view is visible. So in other words, most of the viewport, they consider to now be finished painting. That's what speed index is. And there's a lot of other ones. Popular years ago was the onload. Fully loaded is important just because you do want to know when everything is completely done. But like I said, I chose to focus on speed index. A few years ago, Google and Chrome team came out and said, we really want to have a better metric that measures 3 different parts of web performance. So they called it Core Web Vitals. The first one is largest contentful paint. So whatever the biggest piece of your viewport is, will be the LCP measurement. First input delay, you've probably been to sites where it might paint fast, but you try to click stuff and nothing's active. That's first input delay. And then I'm sure you've been to sites where you are about to click on a button and everything shifts and moves all over the place. That's cumulative layout shift. So I'm going to focus on this now. I found it to be really helpful because my marketing people are actually talking to me about it for the first time for metrics that they hear about. Search engine optimization, all that kind of stuff. It's really coming around. These metrics are a good place to start. So I've switched over to this for most of the sites that I'm dealing with, and we'll see those again as we go through the talk. You need to understand how you want to measure. There's a couple ad hoc ways to do it. So I'm going to show you how to use webpagetest.org. We'll talk about Fiddler. We saw a little bit of that. So first I'll just pop in the web page test. So Pat Meehan had made this years ago, and now it's been bought by Catchpoint. So they've been putting a lot of work into it recently. And then when you come down here, what this lets me do is I can come out here and do a test from various places around the globe. So if you see down here, I can say I want to do a desktop Chrome on a cable modem from Virginia, and I could type in a URL and say start the test. I don't want you to wait here, so I'm going to actually pull up ones I've run. So I chose to host both the before and after. I have them locally here, but I also put them in Azure so that I could get to them from web page test. So I ran the scores for this. The first important area is up here. This is all of the various metrics you might be concerned about. So like I said, the first byte's about 300 milliseconds. Speed index is about 1.7 seconds, so that's when most of the viewport seems to be coming in. My largest contentful paint, though, the one image that they really want to focus on or piece of content was actually pretty slow there at 2.6. There was a lot of cumulative layout shifts, so this is a 0 to 1 scale, so a lot of things move around. And total bytes is just the page weight again. They also give me a film strip view, so I can see how things started to paint. So I can just kind of scroll along here, which is helpful. And then I did 3 runs, and they do another cool thing about this, they do videos. So I find it's very helpful with marketing and business people. I'll tell them you don't want to put a 2 meg image or video on your homepage. Here's why. They don't seem to respond to the metrics as well as they do to the videos. So I'm just going to open up this video and we'll watch the painting experience from the client. So you can see it took a while, about 3.2 seconds there, and then it was still doing some final loading, but that was what that was. I also like to look at the waterfall. So if you've seen waterfall diagrams before, the first thing we'll see is it requested the HTML page. So this is kind of Fiddler-like, but it's showing me a timeline, which Fiddler has as well. But this is just a visual for me of it connected and asked for the HTML, and I got that relatively quickly. Then you can see it pulled down a couple JavaScript files. And if you notice, they put these X's here, which tell me that those JavaScripts blocked my rendering. So what a browser will do by default, which we'll get into a little later, it hits JavaScript. It says, I'm going to stop doing everything. I'm going to get that file, run it, and then I'll continue. And so it won't do any more rendering while it's waiting for that. So you can see all of my other things get delayed because it's waiting on these JavaScripts. It pulled in a few CSS files, and then if you notice here, the images are pretty large. And you can tell that it took a while to get them all downloaded. So there's 2 different shades here. The difference is just while it was downloading or while it was waiting for some reason. And then we can look at the connection view. So I told you in HTTP 1.1, they actually used to create, I think the spec said you could have 2 connections per host. And gradually browser vendors started cheating because it helped them get better metrics. So most modern browsers will open up 6 separate connections per host if it's HTTP 1.1. So you can see it did open 6. And you can see here, the first one had to do some DNS, but each one of them has to actually do a handshake with TCP, which takes a while. And I'll talk about that a bit later in the talk as well. But I like to look at that. That's what it looked like before. You can also save these URLs. Obviously, I did. So typically when I do performance work, I want to capture a web page test before, and I actually create kind of a performance journal. I'll snip a picture of this. So I have the metrics at that time, and then I'll also put in some waterfalls and other things. But I can keep this URL for quite a while, so I can refer back so that I can show a before and after. Because I have been asked months after I did something, why did we do compression or something? It's nice to be able to go show the impact that it had on a client. So again, that's the before. I'm going to pull down the after. Oops. So when I come in here, we'll see our metrics are a lot better. So first byte, a little bit slower. It's just HTML and where it was hosted, so that I'm not concerned about that. The speed index was at about 1.1. Largest contentful paint was down from 3.6, I think it was, to about a second. You can see the cumulative layout shift was 0. So nothing was moving around as it was painting and rendering. It literally was, it came into focus as it should. And there's various techniques we'll talk about that do that. And again, the total bytes was only 101K. So they also, if you notice, they do green, yellow, and red. So they compare my core web vitals and they say how I'm doing compared to other things. So that's cool. Again, we'll look at the video just to show the difference. So last time it was about 3.2 seconds, and you can see it just paints and it's all done. And so there's no shifting and everything came in pretty quickly. And then if we take a quick look at the waterfall, it's not connecting worse here, so to speak. It's just the whole timeline got compressed. So rather than being 5 or 6 seconds, we're to 1.6. You get the connection for the HTML. And then you notice the JavaScript isn't here anymore. I've deferred that to be down here so it doesn't block the rest of what I want to have happen. These CSS files are blocking. We'll talk about that. So they don't want to start painting until they have all of the CSS. And then you can see the images, the total size of those have gotten substantially smaller because of image optimization, which we'll talk about as well. So that's one good way to measure. I also use what's called, there's really 2 different ways to measure from a client's perspective. One is called synthetic monitoring. And so we pay a service that watches various pages on our site every 15 minutes from various places around the country. And they call that lab data because it's not an actual customer. It's these agents that are sitting on certain ISPs and connecting and recording. So I like synthetic monitoring because every day, every week, every year, I know what that they're running consistently. So I can change a performance thing on my server. I can use a new technique and I can do a nice apple-to-apple comparison to say, hey, last week these agents were here. This week it's 20% better or whatever. So that's interesting, but it doesn't always show me what actual customers are experiencing. So I've started to use RUM, Real User Monitoring. There's a couple browser standards that came out that give detailed timing at a browser level. So RUM tools, you pay a vendor, you typically include a piece of JavaScript. They record all of the timing for DNS, connections, time to first byte, all the kind of things you saw with web page test. They report it back to a server. So I can actually go look at all of my customers. And if I get a complaint from a specific customer that the site is slow, I can actually go in the RUM tool, look that session up, and then see exactly why they were slow. Were they slow because of a third party? Did my server not respond? Was their entire connection not very strong? So I use all of these things to get a good picture. So you need to know how to measure so you can tell that you're making improvements. And there's a couple different ways to do that. Is it good enough? It is important that you understand the impact performance has on your website goals. So it turns out Amazon and Walmart wanted to know. So they both did independent studies. They said, we're going to make our site 1/10 of a second slower, so 100 milliseconds. And it turned out, ironically, they both lost 1% of their sales. So if you think of that being 1/10 of a second slower, they just did an A/B test, meant they lost 1% of their sales. That's a pretty huge impact. I would love to know what the impact is for my site. I've asked if I could do a test like that, and marketing people usually don't respond to intentionally slowing your site, just a side note. So I haven't been able to do that, but I'd love to, because if I could A/B test that and know the impact, then every time somebody came and said, I want to put a new font on the site because I think it'll help our branding or whatever, I could measure and say, that's 200 milliseconds, and I would know exactly how much sales that's likely to cost us. So then I can turn it back and say, do you really believe that font is going to add 2% of your sales? Otherwise, every discussion is typically the same. Somebody wants a new font, they're going to put it on the site. If I could get it down to be math, it would be a lot easier discussion. So if you can do that, that's great, but you want to know how sensitive your customers are to performance things, because that helps you sell changes that you want to make. There's also a couple places you can go to compare against others. So we'll go to the speed curve one first. So they are a RUM vendor, and they make this available. You can come out and run this. And what it does is, I happen to be in retail. So I want to look at retail in the US on a slow device And in this case, I'm gonna look at speed index. And I like to show this because Jupyter Research did something on performance, decades ago and said it has to be 2 seconds, right? That if you've ever heard that metric, whatever the metric was, right? It has to be 2 seconds or it's not gonna work. You can see the eBay's, Lowe's, Amazon, Target, nobody is fast when they have a slow connection, right? I mean, so if you get feedback that your site's not fast enough and why aren't you down at 2 seconds, you can at least go show that, neither's Walmart, neither's Amazon. That's just a typical experience. You can come out here and play with it, but it's nice to be able to show how you compare against large sites, just so people know that you're in the ballpark or you're not. The other one is Google Crux. So people who use Chrome, and there's certain rules about how it works, but they're sending telemetry. They're basically doing Chrome specific RUM for free. And you can come out to this URL and actually punch in a site. So I'm not going to do this again because it takes a little bit. But if I go to this URL, I can enter my domain. It will go tell me some metrics that it's captured from actual Chrome users. So it's kind of a RUM light. If you can't afford to have your own RUM, it's a nice way to compare. So before I had RUM, I would use this just to say, our site's getting better or worse for real customers, at least those that are using Chrome. And again, avoid unnecessary optimizations. You do want to understand what performance impact is, so you kind of know when to stop. And even though some things might be faster, they might not work in your environment from a process standpoint. And I'll mention a few of those as we go. Okay, so I've gotten through all the background stuff, know what you want to measure, know how you're going to measure, and now I want to start getting into techniques. I'm going to focus, because this works for all sorts of different servers and we might be from all sorts of different environments, I want you to focus on the concept more than me showing you how to go light it up in your given server. So the way compression works, the server evaluates a header from the client. So all the modern browsers will send an accept encoding header, and they will typically send gzip, deflate, and brightly. So they're telling the server, I understand how to do compression, which is basically take the file and make it smaller. We did this many years ago. We were actually running out of bandwidth in rural Minnesota for our site. So we turned it on to save bandwidth. And the day I turned it on in IIS, the next day we cut our bandwidth usage in half, which is huge, right? I'm only paying for half of what I would have paid for otherwise. It gave me a much better ceiling for continuing to grow the site. The other good thing is it was 25% faster. So my synthetic measurement said not only am I saving money on bandwidth, but it's faster as well. And for me in IIS, I actually enabled dynamic compression, which just means that my ASP.NET pages get compressed as well. I'm going to clear this. I'll go back to the after version of the site. Hit Control F5. So you can see here's Bootstrap. I'll take that as an example. If I go under the inspectors, it's showing me a transform right here. There's a little bar here that says this is encoded. In other words, this is being compressed. So if I took that compression off, we're at 36K right now. If I took that off, it would be 160K. So that's a huge reduction. And I'm going to use this for CSS, JavaScript, SVGs, any of the text-based things. Images actually have compression built within them. And so I'm not going to use it for those file types. But you can see across the board, if I look, here's a jQuery that was 31, would have been 72. Very easy way. And by the way, I tried to rank the techniques. I won't say always do. Everyone in the world will benefit from this, but I've ranked them as you're very likely to benefit from this. So do a test before and after in your own environment to prove it. But servers support this. A lot of them do static for free. Test it out. It should be a really easy win on text files. Next one is content expiration. So the idea with this one is if you visit my site today, you run my ASP.NET page, I give you HTML back. I'm going to reference fonts, images, CSS, JavaScript. You're going to download them all if this is the first time you've come. My goal is if you close your browser and you come back tomorrow, I would love you to make a request for my ASP.NET page. And let's say nothing's changed. I would love to use your browser cache, right? Why not pull all the images, fonts, JavaScript right off your own machine. It's going to save me bandwidth, server load, all that stuff, and it's going to be a lot faster because it doesn't have to go over the network to get that. By default, if you don't specify an expiration, what happens is the browsers use what they call heuristics. So they look at the image last changed and they try to guess the likelihood that it might have changed. So if you've ever done a trace and you see a 304 response, that means the browser wasn't sure if it was fresh or not. So it sent to the server and said, I have one right here I could use, but I don't know if you've changed it. And the server sends back a 304 with, I didn't change it. Especially for small files, it's just as bad to ask the question as download it. So we really want to avoid needing to ask that question. I want to specifically choose for each piece of my content how long I consider it fresh. When I tell people this, some of them people get worried and say, well, that's okay, but what happens if I do have to change the file? How do I force it to be downloaded? So a good example, if my site had logo.svg, for instance, if I want to force an override, I can just change the URL. I could call it logo1.svg. I could do logo.svg v = 2. As long as I change the URL, the browser will not use what's in its cache and it'll come back and ask me, so I can get the best of both worlds. Where I can see that in Fiddler, it's got this caching column. So I always want you to come back and run my ASP.NET page because maybe something changed in the database about you or orders you've placed. All of these other ones, so I got the CSS files. You can see it's got a max age. This is in seconds, which turns out to be a year. So I basically say for my CSS, JavaScript, here I'm not doing versioning. I do that on my real site. And because I version, I want them to last a year. In this case, I said I want images to last 30 days. So if I don't override the URL, at least 30 days from now, you'll come back and check if there's a newer version. So again, you can see on the after I did it, on the before I didn't do any of them. So this is just, again, it's pretty easy. In my case in IIS, I just go at a folder level. I have an images folder, a CSS, a JavaScript. I just choose how long I want the caching to take place. I set it there, and then hopefully your customers are pulling off their own device. And like I said, not only is it faster, it saves me all that bandwidth and server load. Next one is Content Delivery Network. So I love how things work. Literally, two Google engineers were sitting in a bar. It sounds like a joke, but they were. And they were having an argument about what matters more, bandwidth or latency. So if you're familiar, every time you go buy internet service, all they talk about is their bandwidth. You know, we're 10 megabits per second, 100 megabits, gigabit, whatever. So they said, which one actually matters? Because latency instead is how long it takes for you to send to the server and get a response, which is highly impacted by distance. So you can go read this. They did a very structured test where they adjusted just the bandwidth or just the latency. And it turns out for most websites, bandwidth doesn't really matter. It makes a difference for the first couple megabits per second, and then it really flattens out. However, if you can cut the latency, it has a direct impact on your performance. Obviously, every site's not like this, right? Netflix, streaming services, they probably need more bandwidth, but most sites, you want to focus more on latency. So the idea is I can't necessarily make you any closer to my data center in Minnesota, but what I can do is a CDN has a global network of servers that are closer to my customers. And so the idea is, let's pretend we have a CDN server in Atlanta. The first one of you comes to my site, it would ask for the ASP.NET again. It would ask for images and fonts and stuff. It would go to that CDN server. The CDN server would say, nobody's ever been there before. It would come and pull off of my server and then cache it locally in Atlanta. So then everybody else who hits my site will just get it from that CDN server instead of having to come back to Minnesota. And especially if you have a global site, this can make a huge difference to performance because you're serving it much closer to where your customers actually are. So again, we used this years ago, had a big impact for us. There are so many CDN providers these days, it's pretty cheap to be able to find a good vendor. We use it for our static files. So all of our images, CSS, JavaScript. I put fonts in italics. I don't know if I'll have time to get into the details about some of the connection handling in HTTP2, are a little different fonts, but I do host all of these on my CDN. So ideally, you're only coming back to Minnesota to run the ASP.NET page. Everything else hopefully will get served by a CDN server that's close to you. And the CDN server respects all the same expirations that a browser would. So that CDN server in Atlanta will only have to get the logo file once. And if I tell it keep that for 30 days, it'll just keep serving that. And then after 30 days, it'll come back and say fresh, and then it'll keep going. So I'll show you a quick example of how you would code that. So here is a typical non-CDN, right? Where I had a local images folder, I had this flag small. As soon as I pick a CDN, they're typically going to give me a subdomain. So let's pretend I'm example.com. I would get cdn.example.com, for instance, and the magic is when you're in the browser and you're in Atlanta, you're going to do a DNS lookup for this. The CDN will give you back the IP address of the closest CDN server. So it'll say, here's the IP for the one that's in Atlanta. This is all I have to do differently, is I have to reference it using this full URL. You might notice I use protocol-less URLs if you didn't know about these. I don't have to put HTTP or HTTPS. It'll pick up whatever my page is using. Years ago, we would do a mixture where we only used HTTPS on our login and our checkout. Everybody should be using HTTPS everywhere now. And so I would probably just do HTTPS there, but I had to live for a while where my code would be possibly used on two different pages. I just used this trick so I didn't have to switch how I was referencing it. So again, that's all I have to do, code differently. I did put this in there in case you want to see how to do it. I had one CDN hiccup years ago where my CDN had an issue and it wasn't serving any of my JavaScript or CSS. So my pages were blank, which is unfortunate. So I learned how to write this fallback code that day. This basically says, hey, if you get here, if jQuery is not loaded, load it locally instead. So I get, again, the best of both worlds. If the CDN got it to the client, yay. If not, it'll actually come back and pull it from my server. It'll be slower, it'll use my bandwidth, but at least it'll work. One other note, I've had questions in the past. People would say you should pull jQuery and other files off popular CDNs, in this case, Microsoft CDN, because in the past, people would say then if a visitor had visited another site that used that same CDN, they wouldn't have to download it again. Don't follow that advice anymore. A couple of years ago, browser vendors started to sandbox it. You're better off pulling this jQuery into your own CDN, because otherwise it's got to do a DNS lookup. You don't get any benefit if they already pulled from this site for a different website on your machine. It still won't reuse it. It's just a browser protection and security thing they implemented a couple years ago. So that is CDNs. I'll talk about bundling and minification. So again, HTTP 1.1 days, we wanted to reduce the number of HTTP requests. So one of the main things people would recommend is take all of your CSS files and bundle them into a single CSS file. So instead of having maybe 15 CSS files, you have one. And back in the 1.1 days, that was good advice, because you'd want to take a single connection to get that combined file. You also want to minify it. So I'm just going to show you what minification looks like if you haven't seen it before. If I open up Bootstrap here, I'm just going to go to the raw view. I'll open it up in Notepad. You've probably seen things like this, right? It just takes out all the white space and stuff. So today, always minify in production. If you need to be able to troubleshoot, you can use source maps. So if I open up DevTools, it'll go pull a source map that maps my minified back to original. So I can still do client-side debugging, but all my customers don't care, right? They're not going to be stepping through my JavaScript and CSS. So you want to minify it because it's a lot smaller file. So if I were to go use Bootstrap again as an example, The minified version is about 60K. If I go to the performance before, that is 134K. So you do want to minify. Whether you want to bundle or not, we'll talk about when we get to HTTP 2 later. When I did this originally, when it was HTTP 1.1, we actually made our homepage 46% faster. So just during our build process, minifying our CSS and JavaScript and putting them into one JavaScript file, one CSS file, it made that big of a difference for performance. So like I said, going forward, still minify. We'll talk about whether you should bundle or not. Really depends on your HTTP version. So now we'll get into images. So the next big area for page weight is really images. This is where I see quite a few mistakes. So the first advice, I used to use a lot of techniques that I don't need to use anymore that used an image when now I can do better. So a good example would be web fonts. I've been doing web work for a long time. So before we had web fonts, our designer would say, I want to see this text in a specific font. They would actually make an image of that text with that font, and now I would be referencing image files. It turns out now with web fonts, it's much more effective to use web fonts. Another example would be gradients. We want the color to slowly go from red to white, for instance. That wasn't possible before. You had to use an image. That's now built into CSS3. So the gist is if you can use CSS3 techniques to get these features, you're going to be a lot better off and just don't use an image if you can do it another way. Next thing is make sure you choose the proper type for your images. If you're doing logos or clip art or that sort of thing, you want to use an SVG. So an SVG is a scalable vector graphic, which just means no matter what size device you're on, it uses mathematical functions to draw it. So if I'm on a phone or a big desktop or a huge TV or whatever, it'll be perfect because it's using math to scale it. So it'll always look correct. If you're doing a photo, you want to use a JPEG or today, possibly a VIF. So let me go show you why. First of all, I'll go out to Can I Use. So if you haven't seen this before, Can I Use is a site that tells me how good a browser support is for a given web feature. So I know AVIF is a new photo image format, and it's quite a bit smaller than most JPEGs. So if you compare the same photo, JPEG and AVIF, it's probably 20 to 30% smaller to be an AVIF. But if I come out here, I can see for me personally, it's not supported by Edge, and worse, it's not supported by Safari or Safari on iOS. That's a lot of my customers are Safari and mobile. So I'm not going to use this. There are ways, and I'm going to talk about responsive images in a minute. There are ways to serve an AVIF to those that see it and fall back to a JPEG. But this is a good example for me personally. It's hard enough to get the right photos in the right sizes, compressed correctly. It's hard enough process-wise that I've decided not to go after AVIF and fallbacks. You can make that decision on your own, give it a shot, see what you want to do. There's also WebP, which has a little better support today, but I'm sticking with JPEG. The reason you want to do JPEG, people will often challenge and say, well, you can do that with a PNG too. You can. So usually if you have a debate, try it, right? If somebody's saying it's not right, I usually say, let's compare them. Here's my JPEG. I went to Sydney, Australia, and you can actually walk up the Sydney Harbour Bridge to the very top, which is super cool. I found out my dad's afraid of heights that day, so I probably should have talked to him. That's about 58K. The corresponding PNG, which looks visually the same, is 516K. So you can use a PNG for photos. The reason JPEGs are better is you can optimize them, which I'll get to shortly. But again, if you're not sure, make them both and find out. Check the quality, check the size, make your own decision. But JPEGs generally will beat PNGs for photos as long as you're optimizing them correctly. So responsive images, so our site is responsive. So responsive design came out quite a while ago. And it basically says your site's going to morph based on the width of the viewport. So phones, tablets, desktops, etc. There are various breakpoints at various widths. When responsive first came out, the technique was cool, but there was still just image source, right? That's the only tag we had. Well, if you have to decide, I want to show an image that'll look good on a high pixel density desktop and on a phone, you're going to pick a really big image. And the problem was responsive design got kind of a bad performance rap because it was downloading these huge images down to phones where it only had to show them really small. And the phones, the connectivity just wasn't very fast. So the community actually went to the browser vendors and said, we need a solution. They came up with what's called source set and picture. What the code looks like here. I'm going to show you source set. So here, instead of using an image with a source, I'm going to use source set. Ignore the wizard behind the curtain here for a moment. I'm going to come back to that. But if I use this attribute source set, I can create an image at various widths, and then the browser will decide based on whatever it wants to use, connectivity, speed, pixel density, how big it knows the image has to be on the viewport, and it will pick the best image. I choose to embed my widths directly in my file names, just because then when I look at weblogs, I can see which sizes are the most popular. And again, why would I want to do this? If I just use the biggest image for the bridge walk, it would have been 187K, the really high quality, what I want for a desktop. But if I'm on a phone and I've got a very small photo, that's only 2K. That's an 100 times difference between those two. And so by using source set, I'm letting browsers intelligently choose in the situation which one it wants to use. I had a little bit of problem getting over the let the browser make decisions that I would typically want to make myself, but it's worked really well for us. So that's source set. There's also picture, and what picture lets you do is it does the polyfill I talked about. I can say I have AVIFs. If you support that, yay. Here's the various sizes, but if you don't support that, here's JPEGs. Makes my markup quite a bit larger, but I get that polyfill for the two types of images if you want to do that. Picture is also good for what they call art direction, which is I want to see the whole bridge, but maybe on the phone I'm going to crop to just the people that are walking. If you need different views of the same image based on the width, then you want to use picture. But the important part is, again, it's not hard to write that code, but it makes a huge difference on the page weight by taking advantage of responsive images. I'll mention that there are client hints as well. So this is another browser thing where they're going to start to send to the server. Here's my pixel density, other information so that I could decide server side the specific image I want to serve. So I could look and say, oh, okay, you handle this type of image. You've got this connectivity, whatever I want to do. It's still a little early for support, and it doesn't work on your first request, which I don't love. So I just wanted you to know that it's there in case you want to take advantage of that. So again, why do I like JPEGs? JPEGs have compression that lets me trade off size versus quality. Every time I tell a designer that, and I just did this last week, I say, you can trade that off. They kind of freak with, you can't reduce the quality. And I'm not saying I'm going to make it fuzzy to save some bytes. What I am saying is you can play with that line to where it's the point where it's a lot smaller, but it visually looks the same. And often they don't believe me, so I go do this. I actually go create a page like this. And I actually did this with one of the designers. I said, here's a page, here's the images. If you can find yours, the original, I'll use yours. If you can't pick the original out of this, I get to pick mine. And so any tool you use, PaintShop Pro, Photoshop, they tend to have when you save the JPEG, there's just a little slider and they'll show you the two images. You can just play with that slider just up to the edge of where you see it affect quality. So I'm nice and throwing a couple freebies here, right? That obviously stinks, and so does this. But if you look at the rest of these, even side by side, it's hard to tell. Well, it turned out the designer couldn't pick the original, even though they swore that that would make a difference. It turns out this is the original. This is the optimized. So I've gone from 172K down to 32K. So that was most of the improvement, or a lot of the improvement I did, besides the compression and minification. When you saw the before site, most of it was JPEGs. Doing proper optimization like this is a huge win, and you'll often greatly reduce your page weight, again, without sacrificing quality. The other thing to be aware of is there is a format called progressive JPEGs. So I'm going to go into Fiddler Classic, and I'm going to make it simulate modem speeds. I'm going to go back and pull this up and just show you. I want you to see how these paint. So I'm going to hit Control F5. The left one is a progressive, which means it paints the overall shape of the image and then slowly makes the quality better. On the right is what 95% of internet images are for JPEG. They're at the baseline. So if I do that again, watch that paint. It sure seems from a performance standpoint, like right about there, the left side is done. The right one just makes you feel like you're in pain, right? Watching that thing paint is just horrible. That has a real impact on people's perception for performance. So progressive is another thing that it was super hot in the modem days. Used to code during that time. It's becoming important again as people have slow connections. Your tools typically will let you save as baseline or progressive. Generally, they turn out to be the same physical number of bytes, but just because they paint differently, it gives a perceived performance boost. So a lot of sites have been moving back to progressive JPEGs. You can do all the same optimization and everything else. It's just how it chooses to paint the image that makes it seem like it's a lot faster. I'm going to turn this back on so we're not slow for the rest of the talk. The other thing to note is if you snap a picture with your camera or your phone, there's often a lot of metadata in it, meaning shutter speed, lat long, all that kind of stuff. Your site users don't care about that stuff. They're not going to see that stuff. You can actually use tools to strip that out. So I use one called JPEG-tran. It's just a command line tool. So as part of our image processing, we run that. And I'll show you the size difference. Here is my compressed flag with bridge. It's 47K. I'm going to take out, I got down to 32K just by taking out that stuff. So if you go look at this properties and you look at details, here's the stuff, right? I took it out with a Canon PowerShot G1. Yay, here's my shutter speed, right? I don't even frankly care about a lot of that. Certainly my customers don't. They don't want to sit and wait to get this extra stuff they're never going to see. So Fiddler has an extension called Show Image Bloat. If I go back to this page, I'm going to pull up the metadata. If I hit Control, it's going to show me with bricks how much, what percent of this image is actually metadata. So you can see 15% of this image size is due to that metadata. So JPEG-tran just cut it by 15% without any visual quality impact, because I'm not playing with the image, I'm just stripping the metadata out. So that's another easy win for image optimization. And it just shows me here in Fiddler which ones have metadata. The next thing with images, I had a designer. We used to have so we're a frozen food site. We have ice cream. We used to do what search engines did, where you had page 1, page 2, page 3. Our designer came and said, I really just want it to be on one page. It's better for SEO. It's a better user experience. I said, that's great, but we might have 50 or 60 different ice cream products. I don't want to download all of those images that you may never see. So I use a technique called lazy loading. And so the lazy loading, the idea is I'm only going to load the ones that are in the viewport, and the rest of them, as I scroll the browser's this plugin I have here is going to notice that this one's about to come into view. It will switch its source so that it'll force the download. And if you're doing it right, it'll catch up as you go. So I'll just show you what that looks like. right here. I got to go to after again. I'm going to hit Control F5. I'm going to go into Fiddler. I'm just going to mark this one as orange because that's how far I was, right? Now if I go start scrolling down, as I scroll, these images are actually being lazy loaded. I didn't notice. I happen to be on a fast enough connection. It didn't show it to me here. Typically I'll see those other images will get downloaded right here as they're being downloaded. So again, most of the images, you only want the above the fold ones to be normal. That's what this data thing is. So to use, so I'll show you this. I use a plugin called Lazy Sizes. There is native support. It's starting to come out in browsers. Again, you check on your user audience whether you want to switch or not. I am still waiting, so I'm still using the JavaScript. I've been using it for years. It works very well. All I need to do is put a class on called lazy load, and then instead of doing source set, you put data dash source set. What data dash does is it allows you to make custom attributes that the browser will ignore. So the browser is going to come to this image tag and see there's no source set. So it just sits there. It says, I'm not going to do anything because I don't know what you want me to do. As soon as I'm getting close to where this is going to be in the viewport, that JavaScript kicks in and copies this data source set to source set. As soon as that does that, the browser says, okay, now I've got these 5 image widths I can choose from. It'll pick the right one and download it. So again, I'm just delaying. It's a life is trade-offs, right? Performance trade-offs for me. I want the viewport to paint as fast as possible. That's what's important to me. As you scroll down, occasionally, if I'm on a super slow connection, as I scroll down, you'll see it start to have a space there and then fill in. That's worth it for me, right? That's a trade-off that you can decide on. But if you have a lot of images way down the page, it could make a huge impact on your initial paint. So that is lazy loading. So now I'm going to talk about, I like lazy loading. Again, I have a lot of JavaScript on our site, beacons, third-party stuff. I really don't want to load it doing the normal script tag because as we talked at the very beginning, when the browser sees a script tag, it's going to sit there until it's done downloading. So every third-party vendor I work with says, hey, we're great, we're fast. Put our script at the top of the head because we're the most important, right? I want to download first. And I tell them that could make me wait. Like if you're slow, my whole page is going to wait. And they often don't believe me, so I'll go into Fiddler. You can set it up and make their request be intentionally slow. And then I can show them that I'm sitting there waiting. I don't want to do that. So I created, this was quite a few years ago, I created my own technique based on the lazy loading plugin. And I defer. So again, this is my own code, so use at your own risk. It's been helpful for me. So what I do, I've got these JavaScript files down here. So these are JavaScripts that I don't need to paint the original screen. So here's a third-party script. Maybe it's analytics, maybe it's who knows what, tracking, whatever. I don't want this to load until all my important stuff loads. So by putting this data deferred source on, again, it's doing the same trick we saw with the lazy load. It's not going to do anything until that changes and gets copied over to source. So what I do is I've got on load for the body. So the onload event fires when all my first critical things are downloaded. So the images, the CSS, all the normal stuff I care about, this fires. And then this is my custom JavaScript I wrote that just says, go look for every data deferred source and change it to just be source. Same for source set. You can extend this to frames and other things. But again, now what I'm doing is this third party could be super slow and I don't care because now the thing's going to paint fast, onload will be done, then I'm going to do. So I've moved most of our third party, almost all of them, to be loaded in this fashion so that they can't possibly impact my customer's experience from a performance standpoint. Well, not long after, browsers actually added the ability to do something similar. So I still like using the deferred I use. It's better than this, but I want you to know that this is built in and I'm going to show it to you. They created what's called async and defer. So first I'm going to go look at my, So here's the naive way to do this, right? Here's my 3 script tags, and then here's my content. If I were to go load this, actually show you the trick I talked about before. I just take the files I want to make slow. I can drag the request over to responder, and I just say make these be delayed. So the alert1.javascript is going to get delayed 4 seconds. The second one will get delayed 2 seconds, the other one 3. And this is great because I'm specifically making individual requests slow to see what impact it has. So now that I turn that on, I'm going to go back, watch what happens to my customer while those are slow. They're sitting waiting, the stuff runs. That content did not appear until the JavaScript was done running. So what I want to do instead is I can come on here. This is, you can go check, can I use, but this is pretty well supported. If I put on async, I'm telling the browser that these JavaScript files are not part of the paint. So please don't freeze on them. Render the rest of the page while those happen in the background. And what I want you to do is download them. I don't care what order you get them, run them in. Whoever's the first, run them. So if I go do this again and I'll hit Control F5, you'll see the contents there immediately. So they're not slowing up the page rendering, but you'll see my second one finished first. So it ran it, then the third, and then the first. So again, the big thing is I'm not making the customer wait. The page is being rendered. That stuff's happening in the background. So async is okay. I tend to use defer. I won't get into all the life cycle stuff here. I did do a performance calendar. If you've ever seen that, every fall I did a whole thing on async, defer, and these methods. Defer is just later in the life cycle, and it keeps them in source order. So especially if this was like jQuery and then some plugins, if these two rely on the first one, you got to make sure the first one runs first. That's what defer will do. It'll be later and in order. So if I go do that again, you'll see it waits. I see the content right away, which is what I care about. Then it's going to run them in source order, 1, 2, 3. So generally, I recommend use defer. Unless you have some odd reason why you shouldn't do that. It's just going to push it later. It's not as late as my custom technique, but it's certainly better than making the content wait. A couple other cool things in browsers are resource hints. Here to show. So let's say I know that I'm going to pull in this JavaScript file down here. I can actually put hints up in my meta tags here where I'm telling the browser, hey, I know you're going to have to go to Ajax later, ajaxmicrosoft.com. Why don't you look up the DNS? So that used to be cool. Hey, get the DNS done. Then they came out with pre-connect, which is even better. That actually goes, does the DNS and does the HTTP handshake. All of that is happening in the background while the page is still being parsed. So if it turns out that I can make this thing be slow here if I wanted to. If it takes a while before they get to the actual script tag down here, it will actually already maybe be connected. So for some sites, they did some measurements and it makes a huge difference because you're actually telling the browser right up front, go get this connection taken care of. So you want to do that sparingly for things like your CDN, important resources that you know you're going to have to do that. I'll warn you, these meta tags are in here because I needed to give you the code. What I would do for production is I can actually make these be HTTP response headers in the web server. So what that does is as soon as the response comes back, I'll just pull up one of these here at random. The response headers come back right away while the rest of the content's coming down. So these are the headers. So you can actually send the same content back in a header. So for production use, I would put a header that says pre-connect. It doesn't even have to wait for all the HTML. It doesn't have to wait to start parsing. Immediately the browser says, oh, I see you want me to go create another connection, and it starts doing that. So again, don't abuse them. Use them only for critical things, but they could make a big difference. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about some miscellaneous things. I focus on critical rendering path. So I really want to have that top viewport paint as fast as possible because that's what I think impacts people's perceptions. couple things to note, URLs are actually case sensitive from a browser perspective. So I've got a page here. Everybody likes their different styles, right? Some people like capital F, capital B. Some people like all lowercase. Some people like, in this case, just the first one capitalized. The problem is if you do this in your project, let's go pull this up in a browser. I've got the same image there 4 times, but if you look, even modern browsers are going to download that 3 separate times. The browser says those are different because of the case. So even though you might have an image already in your browser cache, it's not going to use it. It's going to go back to the server. Now, I'm not going to typically code it that way, but it's very normal that you have multiple developers. And literally on our project, I liked the camel casing. Somebody else liked all lowercase. So we just made a standard that said we're all lowercase. We never want to be in the situation where just because our coding style is slightly different, I want to use what's sitting in your browser cache, and I'm not going to use it if I don't have the right case. So we just chose to make it all lowercase. I'll just mention these. Somebody gave me a font, said stick this on the web server, and I looked at it, I'm like, that's 2 meg. That one font was 2 meg. I'm like, no way am I going to put that on the site. So I think I went to Font Squirrel. I uploaded the font, and it turned out it had all non-English characters in it. And so it had Asian characters, a lot of other things I didn't need in my font because I'm a US only site. So I had told Font Squirrel to strip those out and went from 2 meg down to 28K. That's a huge improvement. So just look into font subsetting and make sure you've got your font as small as it can be. Another thing that's typically security thing, so TLS is what implements HTTPS. You don't want to use SSL anymore. That's been outdated forever. TLS has a new version called 1.3. I won't get into the handshake, but a typical connection to set up for HTTPS used to be back and forth, back and forth. TLS 1.3 cuts it down to just one back and forth. So if you think about, especially in a high latency environment, it cuts the amount of connection time by half. So I actually turned this on. So I just went to my CDN and said, hey, let's turn on TLS 1.3. It might be faster. So many modern browsers support it. Our page was suddenly 20% faster. It's not very often you click a check mark that makes it more secure for browsers that support it, but magically 20% faster either. So look into TLS 1.3 if you can. I'm going to spend just a minute on HTTP 2. This has been out since 2015. They basically looked at HTTP 1.1, and one of the biggest beefs was that whole 6 connection thing. They said, why can't we just have 1 connection? So they got down to where they said, we're going to open up just 1 TCP connection and multiplex all of the images, CSS, JavaScript. We'll just shove them all down that same connection. And that's really the biggest. They did a lot of things in HTTP2, but that actually made the biggest difference to performance. So I'm going to close Fiddler and just show you a quick demo. I hate the demo. I like the demo. I'll explain why. So I'll hit 5. So here's a site using HTTPS, which is encryption, and it took 4.48 seconds. So that's cool. I'll do the HTTP version. And again, oh, I know what I'm doing. Hold on here. If you didn't know, you can force, I gotta find it again. Using Edge, and you can force it to automatically use HTTPS instead of HTTP, which is an awesome feature. I would do that, but that's influencing my demo here. Okay, I'm gonna go back now and run HTTP. Look how much slower this is, because it's doing those images. It has to spread it across the 6 connections. HTTP2, so it's 85% faster. And when you first look at it, you think, well, that's encryption. How the heck is that faster? HTTP2 will only run if you use HTTPS. It's one of the carrots that browser vendors are using. You can't use HTTP2 unless your whole site is HTTPS. But you can see the performance difference. So that's the part I like. It shows you that it does better connection management. I don't have a page that has 360 green check marks on it. You probably don't either. So it's not that big of a spread, but it matters, right? You might have 20 CSS files or 15 JavaScript files. So it does matter. It's just not going to be quite as dramatic as that looks. So now that we're HTTP 2, these were all the things I used to teach people to do in the HTTP 1.1 days, specifically to reduce the number of connections you're making. Probably don't want to do them with HTTP 2. There's a lot of research and debate about this one. People are, I bundle all my JavaScript together. They're saying don't go to not doing bundling at all, but measure and find something in between. The point is all of these techniques were made up just to save you connections, which in an HTTP2 world, there's only one connection anyways. So doing all this work really isn't helping you is the gist. So just check that out if you've done any of this stuff in the past. Couple quick tool things I want to show you in, I'll focus on this one. In the browser, you can actually use Lighthouse in DevTools. So I'm going to go to I'll go to the Before site in Azure, hit F12. I'm going to go to the Lighthouse. So they basically put some AI into the DevTools. So I'm going to say I'm on performance, I'm on mobile, generate a report about performance stuff. So it's going to go analyze that page and it's going to give me a score. And the cool thing is it's also going to tell me a bunch of stuff we talked about today. So hopefully this will finish somewhat quickly. So I like to use this score. I actually use it on my performance reviews. I say, here's my score now. I'm going to get you to this other score for my yearly reviews. It's part of my review to make the performance better. So right now I'm scoring a 53. And if I scroll down, the important part is it'll tell me a whole bunch of stuff like you're not using HTTP2. You're not sizing your images correctly. So if you didn't follow some of what we said, or you want to see the techniques, the cool thing, they have links that explain how do you do this. But we talked about all this stuff, right? Use next-gen formats, that's AVIF or WebP. Watch your render blocking resource, use compression, minify. So it's all the stuff we talked about. So I'm going to clear that, and I'm going to go to the after version of Azure. And I'm going to run the same report. If I can get my, okay. So again, this is just using good rules on the client. I usually capture both mobile and desktop. I have that performance journal. I keep track of what our scores are. Sweet. So I got 100. Now, does that mean the site's completely perfect and I have no performance stuff? No, but it is a quick indicator of I'm using good techniques, and it gives all the metrics that we talked about. There's still some opportunities. I could still cut down on some of my CSS I don't use. I could do a little better on some of the render blocking. But in general, I've made a huge improvement, right, in my scores. There's a thing called Google PageSpeed, which does the same thing, but also checks in the field. So in other words, with real customers on Chrome, it combines the measurements together, which is cool. Some quick resources. I have a full course on this in Pluralsight. A little older, so some of the techniques aren't in there, but it goes into a lot more detail about some of the optimizing images and other techniques. I also have one on images that really dives into how to use things like Paint Shop Pro to do the JPEG and the progressive. Most recent one, debugging your website with Fiddler and Chrome DevTools and Fiddler. So if you're interested in learning more about Fiddler, that is my Twitter, email, blog, and that is the link to the slides and the code. So again, you have the slides and then you have a before and an after. So you can just see some of the coding techniques to take advantage of. So with that, we'll see if we have any specific questions on things.
Got nothing in the chat, but if you've got a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
I had to kind of fly through those. That's how that usually goes. So if you get the concepts of why they're important, then that's the important stuff. Do we have a question?
So a thumbs up. A lot of good tips in there. There's a few things that have changed since the last time we've talked about such things.
Yeah, Well, it seems to be really evolving. Trying to remember the one that I just saw this last week. So I have a document with all of my performance, and I keep track of articles and techniques I want to try. So I've got this list of, here's a whole bunch of stuff that's pending, and literally it churns a lot. I mean, every couple months they're making improvements. I think Priority Hints is the one that just got some good browser support. So I'm going to start looking into that. It changes often. So.
Cool.
And yeah, if there aren't any questions specifically here when you get the code, or you think a couple days from now and you want to send something, let me know. I also occasionally, I'm in the that.us community. If you're familiar with that.us, we have I do monthly performance reviews often. So if you go to that.us and watch the calendar every month, I've been doing quite a few of them. I'll do a personal review for you. So you just show up with your URL. I'll go through your site with you, for an hour and just review these kind of techniques and point out the top hitters that you could do on your own site that would make a difference for performance. So if you're interested in that at some point, keep an eye on that. I tend to do that at least every other month or so.
All right. Looks like Jay in Seattle has a question.
Okay.
Actually, just a comment, Robert. I just wanted to say thank you very much for this presentation. I found it well worthwhile, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, well, thank you for feedback, especially in the virtual world now. You wonder, is it helpful? Is it not helpful? At least in a room, you get some feedback that's useful. So I appreciate hearing that. Thanks.
So, I guess if there aren't, Todd.
Yes, Robert, you've talked a lot about managing the website resources. Any tips or resources regarding MVC or ASP.NET dynamic pages?
So I guess from an ASP.NET standpoint, I do a lot of server-side stuff. So I said that that's not what I focus on. But the biggest thing that's made a difference for us is really server-side caching, not going to the database or the various services that we use in the back end and keeping that cached on the web servers for reliability and performance. That's made huge differences for us. I don't really have anything else specific. Like I said, most people's sites, it's usually not that you have to spend time on. So I don't have a lot of specific, this technology server side, you're likely to have this sort of a hiccup. But like I said, usually there it's more caching and making sure that you're keeping things that you can share, so you don't have to hit your database as often. Just because you don't have to sit and wait, you can immediately serve it from cache. But other than that, I don't really have any specific configuration or anything like that. These things should work for that as well. So as long as if your first byte is slow, we talked about that metric and I showed it in web page test. If that's really slow, then we could talk, server side things that you would have to look at. But it's pretty rare in comparison that you have a back end issue. Does that make sense? And if you do, what I always do, I just start instrumenting it, right? Just here to here, here to here, and measure and see which area is the problem. But like I said, most often it's been server-side caching has bailed me out of a lot of poor performing back-end services I had to get data from. So
great, makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right, I guess if that's all the questions we have, Robert, thanks so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Educational as always. Always look forward to your talks.
Well, good. Well, thank you for having me.